Hello and welcome to Triage, timely conversations for healthcare professionals, a podcast created and produced by K&L Gates. Each episode is designed to highlight important developments in health law and analyze the impact on our clients and friends of the firm. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
Hey, thanks for tuning into this episode of Triage. I'm Rebecca Schaefer, a partner in the Healthcare and FDA Practice Group, resident in the Research Triangle Park office of K&L Gates, joined by my colleagues who will introduce themselves in just a moment to talk with you today about FDA regulatory developments in 2023 and also what to look forward to in 2024, specifically as relates to clinical research. And so joined by my partner, Mike Hinckle, if you want to introduce yourself.
Glad to be here. My name is Mike Hinckle. I am a partner here at K&L Gates in our healthcare FDA practice, and I'm located in our Research Triangle Park office, and looking forward to discussing what's new at FDA here around clinical research. Elisabeth?
Yep, my name's Elisabeth Lewis. I'm also in the Healthcare and FDA Practice Group, sitting in the Charleston office of K&L Gates, and this is my first Triage podcast, so I'm excited to get to record this with you guys. So I was wondering if one of you could just give us an overview of some of FDA's major clinical research regulatory developments from 2023 before we take a deeper dive into them.
Well, sure. Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, FDA has put out several guidance documents, which are helpful to regulated entities to sort of get a sense of what FDA's thoughts are on things. They're not binding on anyone, but they're certainly very helpful. So we've seen some guidance documents in the area of decentralized clinical trials, a new refresher update on their informed consent guidance, as well as some information around expanded access or compassionate use. And we've seen a final regulation, which doesn't come out that often in the clinical research space. So we've seen a new regulation around minimal risk waivers by IRBs, institutional review boards.
Awesome. Thanks. That was really helpful background. And one of the things you mentioned that caught my attention was the decentralized clinical trials guidance. Rebecca, I was wondering if you could tell us a little more about why that's significant.
No, sure. And Mike and I also had the opportunity to talk about this one last summer, right after it came out. So this was a draft guidance, not yet final, from FDA, came out in May of 23, with the goals and purposes really to be to promote diversity in clinical trials. At least that's one underpinning. So decentralized clinical trials are, clinical investigations, FDA regulated, obviously, that utilize non-traditional clinical trial sites. So imagine in the patient's home or in a local healthcare provider's office, as a way to promote efficiency and also improve participant engagement, maybe more recruitment opportunities, enrollment opportunities, and also really retention, just reducing barriers to getting to your, protocol-driven clinical trial appointment, all of which leading hopefully to making a meaningfully diverse clinical study population. So those are the underpinnings of this guidance, again, promoting diversity in clinical trials. I think what's notable about it, right, just at a high level, is that the regulatory requirements for conducting clinical trials are the same as between traditional versus decentralized settings. And investigators remain responsible for the conduct of the study, obviously, whether it's through, their own research personnel or through contracted services with local healthcare providers. One of the other things that the guidance touches on is how it dovetails with other FDA guidance on use of digital health technologies. So you can certainly imagine a lot of technologies deployed to enable remote connectivity for decentralized clinical trials. And I think there the key point is, sponsors in doing their protocol design need to ensure that whatever technologies they're involving are available and suitable for use by all clinical trial participants. One other question, last thing I'll say about this guidance that's come up with a number of our clients as research sites is how to classify whether a provider is an investigator that should be listed on the FDA Form 1572, or if they are a healthcare provider that should be listed instead on the task log, or maybe they're potentially neither. But just to flag that the guidance has a helpful enumeration of factors that assist research sites and their IRBs in making these delineations. And so just, moving along to, again, Mike's right, FDA put out a number of guidance last year. With respect to the FDA's informed consent guidance document, Mike, do you want to highlight what you think is, noteworthy? I know it's a long guidance, but what you'd call out for our audience from that one?
Yeah, sure. FDA had an informed consent guidance document for industry that dated back to 1998. It was definitely long overdue for sort of a refresher. They proposed a draft guidance back in 2014, and then we got the final that came out last summer in August of 2023. It is a large guidance document. It's 61 pages long, but it covers a lot of ground. Some of it is sort of a restatement of what has been the agency policy going back to the old 1998 guidance. But there are some new areas that have come up since 1998, like the requirement to include a statement that information and results will be submitted to clinicaltrials.gov. That's something that didn't exist back when the old 98 guidance came out. Some other things. There's a great question and answer section at the back of the guidance that we would recommend to folks that address some specific things, like what are the consent and assent requirements for pediatric patients? What about children who were wards of the state? The guidance specifically addresses some of those things, and some of the usual items that come up, like non-English speaking subjects. How do you deal with that? What about subjects with low literacy or physical or sensory disabilities or impaired consent capacity? So those are all issues that are dealt with. They're not black and white answers, because that's not always the case. IRBs need to look at these on a case by case many times, but there's some very helpful guidance that's built into to that question and answer section in the back of the guidance document. There's also some newer things, like the issue of subjects participating in more than one clinical trial at a time. This is something that FDA has discouraged over the years, but never really put out in a guidance document. And now they're much more specific about discouraging that type of participation in more than one clinical trial at a time. And they lay out some of the concerns around that, as well as what kind of information do you provide to a study study subjects in the event that the study is terminated or there's a suspension of the study. These are issues that have come up over the years, and there's some helpful guidance as well on those types of issues. So overall, we would recommend to both IRBs and clinical investigators who are considering the issues around informed consent. Again, this is informed consent that is controlled or set forth under FDA's regulations, 21 CFR Part 50. So these are FDA regulated clinical trials. So if you're out in an IRB or you're a clinical investigator, you want a good primer on what the informed consent requirements are for an FDA regulated trial, we would certainly recommend that latest guidance document.
Awesome. And just keeping with that theme of consent, Rebecca, maybe you could talk about how FDA's final rule on IRB waivers of consent helped harmonize FDA's informed consent requirements with the common rule?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Elizabeth. So this final rule came out just in December of 2023. And as you mentioned, it does further align FDA's informed consent requirements with the common rule, and it replaces a prior non-binding FDA interim guidance that previously provided similar enforcement discretion. And in other words, the ultimate outcome of this final rule is to waive the informed consent requirement for studies that involve no greater than minimal risk. That's a category that's been available under the common rule, which is the federal policy regulating human subjects research that's federally funded. And so ever since the 21st Century Cures Act, there's been a mandate for the agencies to align and FDA to align and harmonize. And so this is another step in that path. On this specific final rule, it codifies an exception from the requirement, as mentioned, right, to obtain subjects' informed consent if the investigation poses no more than minimal risk and includes appropriate safeguards. To be in this lane, the IRB must find and document 5 criteria, which, true to harmonization, are identical to the criteria for the analogous waiver of consent or alteration of consent requirement under the common rule. Including adding the 5th criterion that was added to the common rule in its overhaul in 2017 that relates to identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens. For this one, the IRB has to conclude that the research could not practicably be carried out without using the information or biospecimens in identifiable format. Just, a footnote that this is similar to the HIPAA research-related exception to the authorization requirement. But I think I'll just call it out because it's critical for secondary research with biospecimens. And it occurred to me that this may be even more significant or important to labs that develop LDTs or laboratory developed tests, assuming that the proposed rule, I think we'll come to in a minute, that proposed rule from 2023 to bring LDTs under FDA's regulation is adopted. I think the long and short of it is if those, now need to be supported by FDA regulated clinical investigations, I think that places more importance on secondary research with biospecimens potentially, therefore making this final rule allowing an option for waiver of consent more important, more useful.
Yeah, another interesting guidance document that came out in September of last year, and it's aimed specifically for IRBs, and it's around what some people call compassionate use, or what FDA calls expanded access to investigational drugs, biologics under their IND, or investigational new drug application regulations. That's 21 CFR Part 312. And FDA has put out guidance before around expanded access and how to request an expanded access IND, but they haven't provided a whole lot of guidance to IRBs specifically in terms of how they should review these types of requests and what type of procedures they should have in place. And of course, as many people recognize, IRBs are FDA regulated entities that can be inspected by FDA. And so IRBs are always looking for some kind of guidance from FDA in terms of how they can have processes and procedures in place that are going to be able to survive an FDA inspection. So this guidance document, which is entitled IRB Review of Individual Patient Expanded Access Submissions for Investigational Drugs and Biological Products, it goes to one type of expanded access applications, that is individual or single patient, as opposed to intermediate size or what's called treatment INDs sometimes, which are larger INDs intended to treat larger numbers of patients. So expanded access is really a way of allowing a patient to be treated with an investigational drug for reasons other than collecting data in a form of a clinical study, but it's done under the regulatory framework of a clinical trial. So it's under the investigational processes. So that's always had some concerns and problems for IRBs trying to review these. So this is a fairly short guidance document that I would recommend to any IRB that thinks they may be dealing with either requests from patients or physicians for individual treatment and expanded access INDs. It provides some helpful information around what types of procedures you should put in place, particularly around having a single IRB member review some of these. So it's a helpful guidance in that sense, and so we would recommend it for anybody who's considering, or anybody who has an IRB who's considering how they're going to handle individual expanded access requests.
No, thanks, Mike. That's really helpful. And I think probably completes our roundup for FDA regulatory developments in the clinical research space from last year. So moving on to what we can expect to see from FDA in this realm in 2024. I know I mentioned just a moment ago the new proposed rule for LDTs. So we may see that final rule come out this year. With that, what, Elisabeth, if you could just talk us through what that would change with regard to the regulation of LDTs, assuming FDA proceeds with this final rule as proposed?
Yeah, absolutely. So FDA's proposed rule for LDTs would add LDTs to the definition of in vitro diagnostic products. Basically, this is going to end up subjecting LDTs to the same regulations as in vitro diagnostic products, and that's going to mark the end of FDA's prior enforcement discretion related to LDTs. And FDA has said that their goal is to protect public health, as LDTs are being used more widely than ever before. But taking a look at the comments to the proposed rule, we've definitely seen a lot of pushback from manufacturers in the space. A lot of them have maintained that LDTs are not actually medical devices, and some even took the position that LDTs are so low risk that regulating them as in vitro diagnostic products doesn't make sense and would actually be harmful to patients and hamper innovation going forward in the next generation of diagnostics. So it seems like if FDA does go and push forward with this rule, we're going to see a period of phasing out the old regulatory scheme and watching manufacturers have to come into compliance in stages between 1 and 4 years after the final rule is published. And I think that ends up wrapping up our time. We're just at a time here. So unless y'all have anything else to add.
No, just thank you, Mike. Thank you, Elizabeth, for making time to talk about these developments here today. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in.
Thanks again for listening to Triage, timely conversations for healthcare professionals. New episodes are available for download through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. By subscribing to Triage, you will receive timely notifications for each new episode. Also, if you have any topics you would like to hear discussed on Triage, please don't hesitate to email triagesupport@klgates.com. We would love to hear from you.